Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, March 3rd, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santamaria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Been doing this for over 10 years now, and the way I'm able to keep recording episodes for you and pay both my producer, who does all of my booking, Noelle Dilworth, she's amazing, couldn't do without her, and also my editing team, is because I rely on the support of individuals just like you. We do not charge for the show. We want to make sure it is always 100% free to download. And so those of you who can afford to throw a few bucks our way, you're helping offset that cost so that the people who can't afford to, because we cannot pay for all of the content we consume, it sort of makes it so that I can afford to keep making the show. I use a platform called Patreon, and if you'd like to pledge your support, still at this point on an episodic basis, that may switch to a monthly basis in the future because Patreon's going to be changing their rules. But for now, you can support on an episodic basis. All you've got to do is visit Patreon, patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include Anu Bhadavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamore, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so very much. Okay, let's get into it. I'm excited because this week we are not going to get political. I am tired. I was excited when this book came across my desk because I think it's an important topic, and it was one that allowed us to have a little bit of hope and a little bit of a less internal screaming, at least for the hour. So this week I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Jaap de Roode. I think I'm saying that right. It's a hard name to pronounce, Dr. Jaap de Roode. And he is a professor of biology at Emory University and also the director of the Infectious Diseases Across Scales training program. That program trains graduate students in interdisciplinary science to study and control infectious disease. He also teaches intro bio. We talk about that a little bit on the show. And he has a brand new book out. It's called Doctors by Nature: How Ants, Apes, and Other Animals Heal Themselves. So without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Jaap de Roode. Well, Jaap, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's great being here. Thank you.
I am excited to talk about your new book, Doctors by Nature: How Ants, Apes, and Other Animals Heal Themselves. And before we get into how ants, apes, and other animals heal themselves, I want to talk a little bit about you, about your research, and about how you got into this world of kind of understanding, I guess we could call it animal medicine. So you're a biology professor, yes?
That's right. Yep.
And you're at Emory, which when I think about Emory, it's funny. I probably, because I don't even think I've ever visited the university, but I've known some people who went there. And early on in my training, I was a biologist before I became a psychologist. When I would think of Emory, I would think of Emory as like the place with chimps. It was like the place with apes, and there aren't that many institutions that were doing ape research in the US. And so that's burned into my memory. Is there still a lot of ape research at Emory?
So I'm so glad you say that, actually, because a lot of people, when they think of Emory University, they think of biomedical research. And so there is so much else that is happening at Emory University, a lot of basic science. And that included a lot of the animal psychology. And so, I think Frans de Waal, who is one of my heroes, unfortunately, he passed last year, but he is also from the Netherlands and has done all this amazing work on chimpanzees and other primates to really try to understand a lot of things that we think are unique to humans, such as empathy and social behaviors. So it's wound down. It's not so much anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, that's kind of taken shape across the world, right? Mm-hmm. Like ape research now is happening more in naturalistic settings or sometimes, I guess, in zoos where they have programs that are at least attempts to be as ethical as possible. But yeah, keeping them in captivity in laboratory settings is not as common anymore.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, probably for good reason. Do you run a lab at Emory, or are you mostly teaching, or do you split your time between both?
I run a lab, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yes, so I have a research lab here in the biology department. And in my lab, we study infectious diseases, mostly of monarch butterflies. We also do work on honeybees. I've done some work on malaria in humans. That was in collaboration with the CDC. So yeah, I have an active research lab in addition to the teaching I do as well.
I love that. And so how did you sort of I'm always curious about people's academic paths, especially when they work in these, I think we could call it like a very multidisciplinary field. Like, yes, you
Yeah.
are a biologist. Yes, you do a lot of sort of animal biology, ecology, but also infectious disease
Mhm.
often comes up through micro or through virology. So I'm
Yeah.
curious about your training.
Yeah. So I did a study of population biology as part of my master's in the Netherlands, and that was at Wageningen University. And at the time, I did very basic genetics research. And I remember it was actually my 21st birthday. I went to a 1 day symposium that was organized by my research professor at the time. And that was about molecular ecology. And during that symposium, which pretty much was the first conference I ever attended, there was a talk about malaria parasites and how they competed with each other in the bloodstream of mice. And I was totally taken by this talk. I thought it was so cool, looking at ecological principles, but within the context of parasitism. And that night we had a dinner at my professor's house with all the speakers, and I got to talk to Andrew Reed, who was the professor presenting that work on malaria. And from there on, I actually did an internship in his lab. Then I did a PhD in his lab on malaria. That was at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And then from there, I really liked doing that work. But one of the things I didn't like was that we used laboratory mice as a model system to study these malaria parasites. And I really became interested in studying parasites in a more natural system. And then I discovered that monarch butterflies have parasites that are actually quite similar to malaria parasites in these mice. And then, so when it was time to do a postdoctoral research job, I wrote a fellowship and contacted a lab by Sonja Eltheiser here at Emory University at the time. She then later moved to the University of Georgia. But yeah, I was very fortunate to actually get funding to come to her lab and start working on the parasites of monarch butterflies. And it's a great system. And, I often tell people, I study monarch butterflies because they become sick.
It's fascinating to hear one of these classic stories of an individual who has a very clear research interest. And I'm not saying there's any correct way to be an academic, because I almost did the exact opposite. I also had very clear research interests, but I had to work within what was near me, what was available to me, and then sort of build on that as best as I could. But it's always so, I think, refreshing when you hear about somebody who said, I want to answer this question, and I'm going to seek out the best place to answer this question, and I'm just going to drop everything and go there. I mean, you've lived in several different countries in kind of pursuing answers to these deep questions. How has that been for you, kind of uprooting your life every time?
I don't know. It kind of, at the time, it was kind of normal. And,
Mm.
when I moved to Scotland, I was single. It was easy. Then, when I moved from Edinburgh to Atlanta, I had a girlfriend, and then we moved together because she actually had a job, a postdoc at the University of Georgia. So in some ways, it was actually going where the jobs are. But it so happened that within that new place we were looking at, I could find a research program that really aligned with my research interests. But then since then, it's been way harder to uproot our life. So that's why we have been in Georgia actually since 2005 when we first moved here.
Yeah. Was the transition culture shock for you, or do you think that you acclimated pretty easily?
Well, it was very difficult actually. I went from Edinburgh, which is this really compact medieval city in Scotland, to Atlanta, which is a sprawling kind of American city that is not really confined by any geographical features.
Yep.
And when I first came here, I kept on asking people, "Where is the city?" And they said, "Well, this is it." I said, "Yeah, but I'm used to, Edinburgh had these streets that would crisscross each other. You had multiple levels. Everything was walkable, very easy." And when I moved here, we didn't have Google Maps, we didn't have smartphones. There was no Amazon. IKEA wasn't here. It was really hard to find my way around. So
I
it's
can
definitely got
imagine.
easier over time. But yes, it was hard.
And so we were talking a little bit offline before diving in, but we were talking about sort of the joy that comes from teaching. And I don't know about you, but in my experience, and when I speak to my friends who are professors and who have all of this kind of pressure to run their labs and to write their grants and to publish. Teaching in academic, not always, but in academic culture is often sort of the last on the list, even though more and more I find that professors are saying, oh, but it's my favorite part.
Yeah,
It's the part I wish that they trained me better for and I wish that,
right.
people put more effort into. But yeah, I do absolutely love it. So I've been curious about your experience being able to teach there at Emory.
Yeah, I love it. And I will say one of the great things about Emory University is that the university really cares about excellent teaching. And what that means is that we are not overburdened by it, right? There's a lot of institutions where you have to teach so many courses that you really cannot put a lot of effort in each one of them. And at Emory, that's not the case. So they let us teach at a level where you can really invest in it and really make it worth it for yourself and for the students. And so I've really, really enjoyed it. And right now I'm teaching introductory biology. And I love that because it's a course for a lot of students. It's the first science course they take in college. Some students haven't had biology for 3 or 4 years. And so it's really, and biology to me is the most exciting topic there is because it touches so much of who we are and what we do. And so I really love that. So I feel in this institution, I can focus on my research and try to make that as good as possible and the teaching as well. So it's definitely a focus and not an afterthought.
I love that. And, I don't know about you. I mean, obviously, you have quite a bit of expertise because you've been at this for a while. But I remember when I used to first kind of start teaching in the university system, and you would think, oh, intro bio. I also taught intro psych. I also taught some more like higher level, animal physiology courses like that. But I remember thinking, oh, yeah, intro bio, that'll be easy. And then it's like, no, these introductory courses, you have to know what you are talking. You have to know so much. And you don't know anything until you've taught it. You really don't.
That's right. And what I love about it is the learning aspect as well. And I always tell my students, because it's a broad topic course, so we cover everything from evolution and global climate change to the Krebs cycle and photosynthesis. And I always tell my students, when I was in college, I learned the Krebs cycle, which is part of respiration, part of how we generate energy from breathing oxygen. I learned that in 3 or 4 classes and never really understood it. And now that I teach it, I finally understand it. So it's a really rewarding thing to do.
Oh, I love that. That's why I also love the lab component of lecture, of these science classes, because I feel like that's where the eureka moments often occur for students, and that's where the students who ultimately will go on to become scientists start to individuate and start to realize, oh, this isn't just a didactic or a sort of specific step by step opportunity. This is a place where I can get creative. This is a place where I can push the boundaries a little bit.
Yeah.
Ugh. So let's talk about your book. So you mentioned specifically that a lot of your work has been in monarch butterflies, that you've been looking at these sort of disease cycles, but this book it's about animals getting sick, but then it's about what happens when animals are sick and they do something about it. And so, did this come specifically from your research, or is this a secondary area of interest that sort of, I don't know, was sparked throughout your journey?
Well, actually, both. So before I went to graduate school, I actually spent more than a year doing full time science journalism because at the time I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. And so I was interested in the research, but I was also really interested in science writing. And so writing a book is kind of going back to those roots of an interest in science writing. But at the same time, it also came out of the research because the interest in how animals use medicine came straight from my research on monarch butterflies, and especially the finding that we had in our lab that monarch butterflies can use particular plants as medicine for their offspring. That was really the moment that I realized animals can do this. And of course, I had heard about other animals doing it, but that really made me dive into the topic and learn so much about it that then I thought, this is the book I want to write.
Oh, it's fascinating because I don't think I've ever really thought about. I mean, I guess, yes, it's obvious that there are certain situations and certain examples in which animals have to heal themselves in order to continue with life. And I know that there's a whole area of really fascinating research around animals using like psychoactive substances. Animals kind of doing drugs to have a little vacation from life, or to expand their consciousness. Who knows? We don't know. We can't know. But I guess the question when it comes to healing themselves is that's a pretty broad umbrella, right? Like we're
Yeah.
talking healing themselves from infectious disease, we're talking healing wounds. Like what kinds of things can animals successfully heal themselves from? And what are some things that are just like this happens to you in nature, you're toast, you're cooked?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are plenty of things that will cook or toast animals in nature. And of course, so and really what I wanted to do in this book was focus on parasites, infectious diseases. And partly that's because there are such huge fitness costs, such a huge threat to the lives of animals. But also that's the field that we have most evidence that animals use medicine. You just mentioned psychoactive drugs, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that animals do it, but not very many in-depth studies that really get at what they're doing, if they're knowing what they're doing, and things like that. And so, but with the idea that parasites, pathogens, and things that cause infections, whether it's viruses, bacteria, whether it's worms, whether it's ticks, mosquitoes, they're everywhere and they're attacking animals left and right all the time. And in many cases, yeah, that is fatal, and the parasites win. And but in some cases, it's the animals that are winning by finding medicine and actually taking care of those infections.
That's fascinating. And so, I mentioned injury, which isn't quite a focus, but injuries allow for opportunistic infections, right? Like
Exactly.
a lot of times
Exactly.
that's how animals do and people, that's how we
Yeah,
get these infections.
that's
I
right.
I remember having a MRSA infection, which is not a parasite, right? It's a staph aureus, that's a bacterial infection, and it happened the way that it often happens through like a cut on my skin, and then I had to work real hard to fight it off. So I'm curious when you focus on parasites specifically, what is a common route of transmission? Is it from insect bites? Is it from eating bad food? Is it from, the soil? How do most animals get parasites?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like you said, wounds are often a way for infections to occur. And as a biologist, it I don't really distinguish much between parasites and pathogens. For me, they're kind of all the same. So we can easily call bacteria parasites. I would, as an ecologist, for sure do that. But like you said, they can get them from wounds, but oftentimes they get infections from each other by direct spread. So, for example, the monarch butterflies that I study, when they are infected with a parasite that is actually a protozoan parasite, what it does, it forms spores on the abdomen of the adult butterfly. And then when a female butterfly lays eggs, some of those spores end up on the eggs, some end up on the milkweed plants that she lays the eggs on. And when the caterpillars hatch, they eat them up. So that is one way. Oftentimes, parasites are spread by vectors. And so these are other animals that spread the parasite. So we can think of mosquitoes, for example. Take malaria in humans, right? We get malaria from infected mosquitoes that picked up parasites from another individual and then injected into our blood when they take a blood meal of ours. And that's the same for a lot of viruses, such as dengue virus and yellow fever. That's mosquitoes. Then there are parasites that get transmitted through snails and water. So you think about schistosomiasis, it's caused by worms. It infects snails, and the snails release parasites in water. And then when people go in the water and wash themselves in the water, wash their clothes in that water, the parasites will bury into the skin. And this is not just humans, this is other animals as well. And that is how they become infected. So there's a lot of ways and just eating as well. So you can think of sheep and other animals that graze grass, and think of tapeworms, for example. The tapeworms form these eggs or other stages of their life cycle, form them on grass. And so when the animals eat that, they ingest them and the parasites go inside and start causing the infection. So lots of different ways.
I can't help but but remember a couple of, gosh, it would be years now, older episodes of this very podcast where I had the opportunity to interview, I think Brooke Borrell was one of them. She wrote a book called, I think, Infested, and it was about sort of like lice and scabies, or no, it was about bed bugs. And I remember another author, gosh, I'm blanking on the name and I feel really, really bad about that, but another author who wrote quite a bit about sort of these human experiences of infection and the psychology behind that, how we've baked into our culture and sort of, I guess, put a layer of like blame and shame. We talk about hygiene a lot. We talk about, poverty versus wealthier nations. We talk about, pestilence and disease, which is often, we use certain terms when we're talking about sort of the lower classes. And it's fascinating to think about, kind of from a pure ecological perspective, just like the monarchs are not, it's funny that their name is monarch, but
Right.
the monarchs are not rich or poor, and they're not, practicing unsafe sex practices or, whatever you want to call it. It's just, this is nature.
That's right.
Nature is that
Yeah,
pathogens will try to spread, and it's not,
absolutely.
the fault of the organism that they made poor decisions in
Right, right,
getting
right.
these
No, and
infections. That's an
no,
interesting way to look at it.
yeah, parasites and pathogens are everywhere. And really, when you think about, yeah, there is none of that like making bad choices and things like
Hmm.
that. But you can also think of it from the parasite's point of view, right? So when you think about that poor tapeworm, man, what a struggle that is trying to get to the next host, right? I mean, we never really take that point of view, but you can really feel sorry for these parasites because their life is hard.
Yeah.
We
And they need a
we get
host. Yeah.
infected, we try to kill them. Everyone is out there to kill them, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a tough life as a parasite. So you can take that view as well.
I am curious though, and this is kind of taking us down a bit of a rabbit hole, but there are, I've talked to different biologists who have different perspectives on certain types of organisms that really do serve a primary ecological function, or at least from our perspective, as disease vectors. And we think about, let's say a tapeworm over here and let's say a mosquito over there. Are there certain organisms who, like, if we eradicated them, it would not really screw up it would only be for the betterment of
Well, yeah,
like our ecology, or
yeah.
are there organisms where we need them, because if we got rid of them, downstream there would be a lot of
Oh,
problems.
yeah. Yeah. So definitely yes to both of those. And one of my favorite examples is worm infections. And so, our immune systems have evolved to deal with worm infections on an ongoing basis, essentially. And what we're seeing in a lot of westernized countries now is that without those worm infections, we have a lot of autoimmune problems where our immune system starts attacking our own tissues. And so this can cause a lot of, for example, allergies are tied to this. Um, but then mosquitoes, by all means, let's eradicate them. And I'm saying that there are a lot of different mosquitoes. Some mosquitoes are fine and good. In fact, some mosquito species pollinate the cocoa flowers from which we get chocolate. And I love chocolate, so let's don't get rid of those. But they're not the ones that spread disease. The ones that spread disease are very much human adapted, and they love human environments. They love shallow standing water. So we have created beautiful environmental conditions for them. So if you get rid of some of those, like Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, the vectors of yellow fever and dengue, things like that, I think we're going to be fine.
Yeah, good. Let's do that. Let's do that. So let's get into how should I approach this? I'm kind of curious about the really little and the really large. So maybe we started this conversation talking about the apes at Emory. Maybe we could dive right into apes. I had this one I do remember. I had an episode of the show years ago where I spoke with the veterinarian who was the kind of lead veterinarian at Chimpanga, which is a research facility, I think in DRC. She talked about how some of these apes, it was an interesting facility where it was open to the forest, and they rehabbed a lot of orphan chimpanzees that were orphaned by conflict. And so, you have that struggle where they were semi-wild. They could go off, but they
Yeah.
often were very dependent on the human beings who rescued them and who worked
Yeah.
with them. And she talked about how some of these apes would come back and
Mhm.
show her their wounds
Oh, wow.
to kind of ask for
Yeah.
treatment. which is fascinating.
Yeah.
And so knowing that those behaviors have adapted, I'm curious about wild ape behaviors
Yeah.
when it comes to sickness. What do
Yeah.
they do when they get sick?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and this is really what kind of spurred the whole scientific inquiry of animal medication. And this was in the 1980s, the studies on chimpanzees. And so, specifically, studies by Michael Huffman, who is a primatologist at Kyoto University. And he was working with a local park ranger called Mohammadi Saifu Kalunde. He worked for Tanzania National Parks, but he was also a traditional healer in the Watongwe. That was the local people that he belonged to. And so, what they were actually studying, they were doing field work in Tanzania, tracking chimpanzees and trying to figure out what do chimpanzees do when they get old. What is the role of older chimpanzees in the social groups? So they weren't looking for medication, but on one of their trips, they had this particular chimpanzee called Chausiku, and they noticed that she was behaving very differently. She was kind of slow. She had, she's defecating, lying on her side, all sorts of things that just didn't quite add up. And then what they noticed is that she went to a plant and then stripped off the branches and then removed the outer parts and started sucking on the inner pith of the plant. And so Hoffman had never seen this, but Mohammadi told him it's plant called bitterleaf. It's something they use within their traditional healing as an anti-parasitic plant. And so then they started thinking, oh, maybe the chimpanzee is doing this as medication as well. And so then the next day they tracked the chimpanzee again and then saw that she recovered. And then a lot of scientific studies, they did a lot of scientific studies following this, making sure that the plant has chemicals that are bad for worms, that worm infections are common in these chimpanzees, and that when they eat these plants, it actually gets rid of those parasites. So that was really the first study that indicated that chimpanzees can use medication. But it wasn't the only one. And so people had known for quite a while, and this actually started with Jane Goodall, who had described this early on, that sometimes when you look at the dung of chimpanzees, you see these whole leaves in them. So leaves that are completely intact, that apparently were swallowed by the chimpanzees and then pooped out whole as a whole leaf, not digested. And so this is something that people started noticing more and more. And so then again, Huffman and colleagues really started looking at that, found that it happens a lot during the wet season when there's a lot of worm infections. And then they found that all these leaves have one thing in common, and it's that they're very rough. So they have really rough hairs on them. And he describes them as kind of Velcro leaves.
Ah.
And then they found that these leaves can basically capture the worms in the gut, so that the chimpanzees they fold them up, swallow them, and then they kind of purge the guts of these parasites. They kind of scrape them out. So those are just two of the ways that chimpanzees do this and keep themselves healthy. But more recently, it has been shown that chimpanzees can also, when they have wounds, they actually pick specific insects and start mixing them with their saliva and rub them in their own wounds or in the wounds of others. So I think there's a lot of different ways that chimpanzees use medicine to keep themselves healthy.
Oh, it's fascinating. And I don't know if you know the answer to this, but it's something that again, I'm always coming at this from my psychologist perspective, but I think about research that has been done on wild, let's say orcas, for example, and dolphin species as well, and this concept of sort of culture.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think about innate practices, but what does that really mean? How much, nurture happens really in teaching an organism how to fend for itself?
Right.
I'm curious, these practices, especially in these complex animals like apes, are they learned? Are they culture bound? Do you have certain groups of apes that use them and other groups across the river that never learned them? Or is there something innate in them that just kind of knows?
I think it's all of that. And so the chimpanzee example is great because it actually has the three components that are important for animals to develop their medication behaviors. So one of them is innate. And so we see this in insects, and we can talk about it later. Then there is individual learning, where animals can learn from their experiences. So say they are sick and they're tasting something new and then they start feeling better. And so now they have learned that eating that particular plant or doing that particular thing helps them. And then there's social learning. So when you think about the leaf swallowing that I just mentioned, you can see that this is a behavior that develops spontaneously. So people have described this in zoos. So you have groups in zoos that where one chimpanzee starts developing this, starts swallowing it, and then you see that other apes copy that behavior. And that's where the culture comes in, because there's multiple ways in which these chimpanzees do it. There is basically how you fold that leaf. You can imagine if you have a long leaf, you can fold it in different ways. And so the chimpanzees, different groups do it in different ways. And so that's a culture, right? That's a habit that different groups do it differently. It serves the same purpose. But yeah, so one individual develops it spontaneously, others copy it, and then the groups are different from each other. And and you often see, even with the bitter pith swallowing that I mentioned with Jim Chausiku. So she had an infant that was very curious as she was using this plant and stripping it, and he was tasting little pieces of it and then like spat them out because they were so bitter, right? But that's another indication that now that chimp knows that that particular plant is bitter. And oftentimes when animals are sick, they like bitter stuff. So even that in its own right, that innate preference for bitter stuff when you're sick, that can also help in developing these behaviors.
Yeah, it's funny, like, when you're very dehydrated because of vomiting or diarrhea or a high infection, you often do crave salt, and
Mhm.
you really, like there's a part of your body that says, "Let's replenish those electrolytes,"
Exactly.
like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. Our bodies are
fascinating.
pretty smart.
Yeah, ugh, but then we think about so I wanna switch gears over, and I'm not saying their bodies aren't smart, but let's go maybe to the model organism that you're most familiar with, the monarch butterfly, or maybe even other insects that you've studied. Uh,
Yeah.
how much of this is decision making and how much of this is
Yeah.
sort of like genetic programming?
Yeah. Yeah. So absolutely. And what is interesting, right, is that in the 1980s, when we had these
Mm,
chimpanzee studies, there was a lot of skepticism. People don't
mhm.
believe that animals can do this. And we can talk about it later. It's mostly Western people who say, okay, animals
Right.
cannot do this. They're not smart enough. But then it was okay. Chimpanzees are closely related to us. They're very much like us. They have big brains. We know they can do a lot of this learning. They make tools. Okay, we can accept that, right? And now we're talking about insects using medication, and so they're not very much like us, right? So that tells us that these animals do things in different ways than we do, or in some, we're learning more stuff about how we do things actually. So to get to the monarch butterflies, you know what, I mentioned that monarch butterflies get parasitized with this parasite that forms spores on the abdomen of the butterflies. Then the mother spread it to their offspring. And so when I was doing this research, I didn't mean to look at this at all. It was kind of just, it so happened. I was growing milkweeds in a greenhouse. I was getting pretty much bored with it because it was a lot of work just to grow the food for the monarch butterflies that I was studying in the lab. And at some point, I said, I just want to grow different plants and see if that has any effect on the parasites. And so I grew different plants of milkweed, some of them very toxic, others not so toxic, fed them to caterpillars. And then, one nice thing about insects that is easy in insects, harder to do with primates, is that you can do experiments where you rear large numbers. I could infect some of my monarchs, leave others uninfected, and then give them choices between the plants that I found were actually reducing parasite infection. Those were the more toxic plants, and the plants that did not. And then, then I found that adult butterflies, the mothers, when they lay eggs, can actually choose to lay their eggs on plants that are more toxic and that actually reduce infection in the offspring that she hasn't even laid yet at that point. And so, really, that tells us that you don't need a brain like ours or like a chimpanzee's to do this kind of behavior, right? And so, then it becomes much more this innate ability that is determined by the genes. When they are sick, they are experiencing this disease, and then they make a different decision based on what they're smelling and what they're tasting. So, I think a lot of these behaviors can be innate, and I think that's what the insect studies are telling us.
So I want to switch gears then and ask, I'm just rapid firing at you because this is also fascinating. What about, we've been talking a lot about sort of quote, wild animals. And of
Mm,
course, that is not anywhere in the title of your book, Doctors by Nature, how
mm.
these different animals heal themselves. And right there on the cover, you've got a big, probably the largest image is of a dog. And so I'm curious about domesticates, whether
Yeah.
we're talking about farm animals, whether we're talking about our beloved pets,
Yes.
animals that live very, very closely with humans, where we have animal medicine. I can take my dog to the vet when he seems sick
Hmm.
to me, but I'm assuming that there are lots of things that he's been through that he handled on his own, and I
Yeah.
didn't even know.
Absolutely. And yeah, and so in the book I talk about this because one of the fascinating things to me is that there's at the one level this idea that animals are not as smart as us, right? And then it's like, okay, well, wild animals they're okay, but when we domesticate animals, we make them stupid, and that is a very common misconception. And it's definitely true that when we domesticate animals, they're gonna have a hard time surviving in the wild, just like it is hard for us to survive in the wild, right? That doesn't make us stupid. It's just we haven't learned the ways to deal with living in the wild. But within that context, people think, well, these domestic animals, whether there are cats or our dogs or our cows or sheep, they just don't know anything, right? And we have to do everything for them. And it just turns out that's completely wrong. It turns out that when you look at sheep and you look at goats and you look at cattle, you look at dogs, you look at cats, they still have those innate abilities or the abilities to learn from their experiences to develop their own medication behaviors. And like you said, the cover has a dog on it, and the dog has grass in its mouth on the cover. And that's because one of the most common things that a lot of people who have dogs will have seen is that their dogs eat grass. It's actually surprising how little research has been done on that. But the little research that is there, and when you compare it to wild animals such as wolves or bobcats, is that they're doing that similarly to those chimpanzees that were swallowing leaves. They like to eat rough grass that upsets their stomach or their guts and basically purges these parasites, whether it's worms or other things, either by vomiting or through their feces.
It's interesting because when we see dogs go outside and start to eat grass, very often you'll see their kind of owners like, no, don't do that.
Mhm,
And I
mhm.
wonder if we should be like, no, yeah, do it, do it. This is a
Yeah,
good thing.
yeah, no, absolutely, and
Yeah.
that's what I say in my book as well, because I got this super super cute little puppy called Tucky, who's a mini poodle, and so to socialize him, I took him to this little dog park here in Piedmont Park in Atlanta, and exactly that. People
Yeah.
get so upset when their dogs are biting on a wood chip or trying to eat grass, and when you realize what they're actually doing that is good for them, you're much more likely to say, yeah, keep on doing it, with the caveat that a lot of grass in our cities is not healthy, right? Because it's
Right,
full of
right.
pesticides um, and fertilizers, so you definitely don't want them to do that. Or if it's grass where a lot of animals have defecated, because then they can pick up parasites. But if it's in your yard and it's clean, or you have some indoor grass that you can get from a pet store, it's actually really good for them.
Oh, it's good to know. And then that leads me, and I know that this is not the focus of your book, but we ourselves are animals, and of course we have evolved or we have developed, I guess, through technology, a massive sort of our own massive technological ecosystem of medicine. But are there things that we're doing sort of all the time that we don't even realize we're doing when we ourselves are sick to try and beat back that infection before we ever call the doctor and say, "Hey, I need an antibiotic."
Yeah, I mean, our bodies are pretty clever, and they tell us what to do and what not to do, right? So one of the things is when we're sick, we rest, right? And our bodies tell us, take it easy, go and rest so that the immune system can do its work. So that's one of the things. You mentioned earlier, when you get severely dehydrated or after throwing up, you crave salt, and so that's your body telling you need to take in salt. This is what you need. But our bodies also make us avoid things. And so a good example is pregnancy. Right? When people are pregnant, they often really have strong aversions for specific things. They just don't want to eat anymore. and that's because it would harm their fetuses. But they crave other things, especially things that have specific minerals that their developing babies need. So their bodies are telling them that. That's not a conscious thing, right? It's their bodies telling them that. And then at the same time, we get aversions for all sorts of irrational reasons because our bodies make associations. And this is oftentimes when people get food poisoning, and they associate that with a particular food that they ate, and it's usually not the food that was responsible. One of the things that I found really interesting in writing this book was about chemotherapy for cancer treatment, where it has been shown that people, before they do chemotherapy, have a nice meal, enjoy the things before they get sick, like eating, for example, chocolate cake. And then they get so severely sick as the side effects of this chemotherapy that their bodies associate that with a chocolate cake, and they can't eat chocolate cake anymore, right? Even though they know it's not a chocolate cake, it's the chemotherapy. And so now when this chemotherapy is done, doctors are aware of that. So they specifically, give meals that are, it doesn't matter if you make that association. So, but what that tells me is that we have all this consciousness and this rational thought, and we know that is not what made us sick, but our body just cannot let us eat it again, right? And I think that's fascinating because it tells us that a lot of these things that we take for granted and that we think are based on our large brain and our consciousness and our cleverness, that's not at all the case. It's our guts doing the talking. And it's those guts we share with all these other animals, including insects. So then it's not so hard to see that these animals can use or make these associations too and learn about medicine as well.
That's fascinating. I remember learning, and who knows if this holds water over years and years, but I remember when I was first taking early psychology classes and learning about that concept of food aversion, which is, a very kind of primal association that we're making, that we were taught about rats and like as a model organism for food aversion because, and correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe you don't know, but from what I remember, rats can't vomit. And so because of that, they watch each other and they develop very strong understandings of what they can and can't eat. Whereas we and many other mammals, we eat something that's toxic to us, we can vomit it up in the hope that we're not, we don't die from it. But rats can't do that. So they're done if they eat rat poison.
Yeah. So they have to eat clay to get rid of the toxins that we vomit out. But yeah, rats are amazing. This is all, it's really hard. That's also why it's hard to kill rats using poison.
Right, because they watch each other.
Yeah, and they're not going to eat it because they are very neophobic, meaning they are very aversive to eating new things. And so, yeah, it's their bodies, telling them, hey, be careful.
That's so cool because it just shows that, certain conserved evolutionary whether we're talking about things that are encoded in our genes or behaviors that come from those genes turning on and off, certain strategies work really well. They're conserved. You see them across the board. And for other organisms, they just take a totally different approach. I love that. And that's probably has everything to do with fitness. It has everything to do with the environments that they, evolved within. And rats are like cockroaches. They live everywhere. They live in urban environments, they live in rural environments, and they can thrive against so many different evolutionary pressures.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah.
And then you've got other organisms that are a little bit less fit, right? They're and I hate to say that because that sounds pejorative. I don't like saying it that way, but I guess their existence is more fragile because they're not as adaptive, because a change in their environment can be catastrophic for them. Do you find any correlation between organisms that have, let's say, higher evolutionary fitness versus those that maybe have lower fitness, or those that are more critically endangered because the pressures, they just can't overcome them, and their ability to use sort of natural medicine to adapt?
So I think that, animals don't really differ in their relative fitness. What they differ in is how generalist they are and how easily they can adapt to new and changing conditions.
Right.
And, and it's one of the things I like to talk in my intro bio classes is to say, everything that lives today has evolved just the same amount of time, right? So everything
you're right. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Evolved.
Otherwise, it would have been extinct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so then the point is really, how easily can they adapt to novel situations? And some animals are just so highly adapted to specific situations that it gets harder to switch. And so you can think of, I like cheetahs as an example. So cheetahs are really well adapted to chase gazelles, right? But at the expense of everything else. So they can run really fast for a very short amount of time, and but then also when they catch their prey, they're so exhausted that hyenas or lions steal that prey very easily because they have no energy left, right? So that makes them in that sense a little bit more fragile. And and it's true also for other animals that are very specialized on what they can and cannot eat. And so one thing that I talk about as a different type of caterpillar. So we have mentioned monarch butterflies that use milkweeds as their host plants. There's also woolly bear caterpillars, and they use actually quite a few different plants, but they're really specialized in eating plants with specific chemicals called alkaloids, and they have actually developed specific taste receptors for them. And this is super cool. When they are infected with parasitoid flies, they just respond to those alkaloids more strongly, and it just makes it makes them taste better to them, so they eat more of them, and that's what kills the parasitoid flies. But that's a case where they cannot just use any other food to medicate themselves, right? It's something that if those alkaloids aren't there, they cannot use any medicine. Whereas, you think about something like chimpanzees that have a much more generalist diet, they can probably use a lot of different things, right? If one doesn't work, they can try something else. Like we saw earlier, they can use bitter pith from one plant, but they can also swallow the leaves of others. So they have a few more options to fight these parasites.
And that makes sense because there's no reason to think that during the evolutionary history of an organism with a, I guess we could say, a more generalist or a more narrow options, that those things changed as rapidly as they have in the age sort of the Anthropocene. That like we have induced these changes, but these organisms aren't. They haven't been faced with that kind
Right.
of evolutionary pressure
Yeah.
previously.
And like you said, the speed at which we're changing things is
Yeah.
just so fast, faster than
Yeah.
most changes that have happened in the history of the planet.
Ugh, yeah, so the one thing we said before we got on air was that I was excited about doing this episode because it was like,
Yeah.
it was gonna be hopeful and we weren't gonna
Yeah.
talk about politics, and so I'm getting off that subject now, and
No,
I'm gonna ask you
we're gonna stay positive.
Yeah,
And
I'm gonna
but,
ask you here as we're sort of finishing out our hour, are there any stories in the book or stories that you're, like, really fond of that we didn't touch on that you would wanna share, or things that surprised you as you were doing research for this
oh
book
yeah,
that really shocked you?
yeah. So yes, both. So let me first talk about something that really surprised me, and that was the fact that we used to know so much, which we then forgot. And what I'm trying to say is that when you look at traditional healers and you look at shamans all around the world, is that they have looked at animals for a very long time to basically get inspiration for new medicines and to copy the behaviors of animals for their own cures. And so you see this, for example, in North American and Siberia and North European areas where indigenous people have always looked at bears and found that bears use a lot of, one of the things they do is they dig up roots, and then people started copying those behaviors. So Osha root is a good example for Native American tribes. A lot of Native Americans in their traditional healing use Osha root as well as a lot of other herbs that they copied from bears. It's even likely that aspirin, which a lot of us have used, which is like a pharmaceutical drug, was actually first discovered by bears, because when bears come out of hibernation, they're all really inflamed and stiff. And one of the first things they do is they start eating the bark of willow trees that is loaded with salicylic acid. And this is actually the basis for aspirin. So people started copying that behavior and eventually, found the chemicals and then improved them to make aspirin. But it's something that
Wow.
bears used way before us.
So I have bears to thank for, like, the I guess what I put on my face to help when I have acne. That's amazing.
Yes.
I love that. That's very cool.
And you have goats to thank for coffee. So, we don't often think of coffee as a medicine, but it is in some sense, and it keeps a lot of people alert. And it was actually
And it makes them
discovered
more
by goats.
regular too.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, goats were eating the berries of the coffee bush, and a herder noticed this. The herder was called Caldi. There's a lot of coffee shops called Caldi. And then he noticed his goats became more active. They started dancing. That's why a lot of coffee shops are called dancing goats. And then a nearby monastery, there was an abbot who started brewing those berries, and that's how they discovered coffee. So we have animals to thank for a lot of different things, for sure. So yeah, so that was one of the most surprising things that, we talked earlier about chimpanzee studies in the 1980s, as if, that was the first scientific evidence. But beyond the science, people have known this. And then we kind of lost that, especially in the Western world, where humans have this urge to be different from nature. And so being one with nature, like a lot of shamans and traditional healers do, was kind of starting to be frowned upon. And the idea was, oh, science is going to solve everything. But so a lot of the stuff we actually already knew, and now we are rediscovering. So yeah, and then to answer your question about, one of my favorite stories, I just love the story of the sparrows and finches in Mexico City that are incorporating cigarette butts into their
I
nests.
read about this.
Yeah, and
And it's adaptive, right? It's not dangerous to them.
it is a little bit dangerous. And that's
It's
actually
risky behavior.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and that is actually something that is true for all this medicine. And so this is something we can think of too, right? When we use medicine, there's all these side effects. So
Oh,
we
yeah, I
tend
work
to
in a
use
cancer center. I mean, I see it all the time, the risk-benefit analysis my patients have to make before going into a really toxic treatment, but hey, it may kill their cancer.
exactly. Yeah, but it's true also for ibuprofen, right? For a lot of things, there are side effects. You don't want to use too much of medicine because it's bad for you. And that's the same for animals, like that bitter pith in chimpanzees. If they eat too much, it can kill them. If you drink too much coffee, it can kill you, right? So we see a lot of that. And it's the same for the cigarette butt. So it causes some problems in the blood cells of these birds. But on the positive side, it's the nicotine and other chemicals in these cigarette butts basically repel and kill things such as blood-sucking mice and ticks, and thereby keeps their chicks healthy. And a lot of birds use all sorts of things. Actually, a lot of birds use aromatic plants, so they collect plants that have a lot of chemicals that can deter these parasites from their nests. But these birds are adaptive, so when there's cigarette butts that have the same function, they collect those instead. So yeah, that was just such a exciting story for me.
And it's I think it's super interesting, and I remember when it was first, kind of making the rounds in the popular science coverage, that it is this interesting adaptation to these urban pressures, to our sort of we think of these as, like, very negative things. Of course, there's cigarette butts on the ground, that's horrible, but, nature finds a way, as they say, and that is really, really fascinating. And so tell me what comes next then. I mean, we did mention that in your previous answer, some of the surprising things that you learned. Um, are we starting to see a shift in pharmaceutical research? Are we starting to go back to those roots to try to learn from these animals and say where, there are probably thousands of medicines out there that we're not taking advantage of?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I was talking to Ulrich Malueki at the University of Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And he's actually doing exactly this. So he's studying bonobos and chimpanzees specifically with this in mind. So he does the field work, he checks what they're eating, then brings the plants to the lab to really collect the chemicals from them, and he tests them against bacteria as well as other pathogens. So that's definitely happening. And then, a really clear example too is about cats and catnip. And this is another really favorite part of the story for me, is that people that have domestic cats, they know about the catnip response. You can buy catnip plants or toys impregnated with catnip chemicals, and your cats will go crazy over it. They love it. They're just like drooling over them and rubbing them and rolling around. And it turns out that what they're doing is they're coating themselves in these chemicals that repel mosquitoes. And so researchers in Japan at Iwate University, they have actually patented the chemicals that they discovered through these cats' behaviors to try to develop a new repellent for human use to protect us against mosquitoes and the diseases that they carry. So yeah, there's definitely an increased recognition, or a renewed, I should say, recognition that animals can teach us a lot of interesting things, and that they have pharmaceutical knowledge that we can benefit from.
Oh, I love that. That's so cool. And gosh, there's so many cool stories in your book. You shared with us so much interesting science. I just have to thank you first for the work that you do, and second for taking time out of your busy schedule to share that with us on the podcast.
Yeah, it's been so great. I love talking about it, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.